Over to you, Todd. Thank you.
Thanks. Hi everyone, how are you going? How's your Mardi Gras treating you? Can't go too wrong, it's pretty good. So today, I'm going to talk to you about cannabis and the spectrum of wellness. Just a bit of background about this. I'm sorry to say, as part of my research, you have to do a review of the academic literature, and this is a part of that. So my angle on the spectrum of wellness and cannabis really is the theoretical perspective. So apologies, it's a bit early on a Sunday morning for that sort of thing, but I'll try and make it as painless as possible. Before I get started, just some acknowledgements. Jiggy Walla, welcome. It's an honour to be at the amazing event here. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Bungjilang people. And it has been an amazing event, fascinating speakers, lots of laughs, heaps of cool little chats with the locals and others around here. Lots of pumping beats and some amazing food. Punch mentioned just before the cafeteria there, I can highly recommend the chocolate, beautiful. Special thanks to Kath and also Punch for pulling all this together. It's really an outstanding job everyone's done. And always love coming back to Nimbin's, it's great hospitality, beautiful scenery, and can't go too wrong. So just my talk in brief, basically this idea came to me as I said, I was doing a systematic review of the literature, and I came to realise that the academic literature regarding cannabis is almost always about identifying harmful consumption patterns, or at least limiting the harmful associations with cannabis. And I found there's analytical blind spots pertaining to non-problematic use, the intersection of medical and recreational use, and pleasure. And these constitute a huge majority of the population of cannabis, people who consume cannabis, and seems to be almost non-existent in the literature. So in this lecture, I'm going to explore the spectrum of wellness as an alternative academic framework. As I said, I'll try and make it as painless as possible. For millennia, cannabis has been associated with the spectrum of, the nexus of mind, body, and spirit. Despite this obvious match, the academic literature linking cannabis to wellness is thin. So just an overview of the talk. It's going to be in two parts. The first part, basically, I'll just give you a brief overview of the current dominant academic frameworks in the literature. And I'll try and whip through that as quickly as possible, and then I'll get into the spectrum of wellness, which is also sort of two parts. There's basically wellness as it is in the academic literature, and then there's cannabis and wellness where there's nothing in the literature, but there's lots of people involved in the movement who have written amazing things about the topic. So I'll just start off with the pathology or the deficit model. A large body of drug policy research has been informed by the hegemonic pathology or deficit model of drug use. This view positions illicit drug use as inherently aberrant, as destructive to both health and happiness, and as reflecting some kind of deficit in personality or social position. International drug controls and prohibition in the US and Australia tend to be informed by the deficit model. According to this approach, it confers the judgment that all drug use is bad, even if an adult consumed a psychotropic drug that had zero risk of harm, it's morally wrong, so it's bad. In other words, it's complete and utter bollocks. So I'd like to, just a bit of a critique of the deficit model. So we can push back when people start spouting this stuff at us, we can push back. First of all, one of the critiques is the stigma that comes from using this framework when we're looking at the academic literature. So the deficit model dehumanizes cannabis users as derelict or deviant and as belonging to the margins of society, and obviously I know there's no one like that here at Mardi Gras. The term user particularly characterizes people as lazy, worthless, irresponsible, and no future. This word user, it doesn't seem like much, but it's all through the academic literature. It's commonly employed everywhere to describe people who consume cannabis, and so therefore much of the academic literature is infused with stigmatizing language when reporting their findings. The recommended term we should use is people who use drugs, just offers a bit more of dignity to cannabis consumers. A second critique of the deficit model comes to the moral approach and also research restraints. So it becomes, under this deficit, pathological deficit model, it becomes difficult to carry out research. What should be factual discussions, such as the efficacy of harm reduction, are frequently treated as moral discussions. So it's difficult to avoid scientific bias in a field that becomes so coloured by issues of morality. Some are guided by a moral commitment to prove that cannabis is harmful. And we end up with this system where cannabis science has become a weapon of propaganda, whereby NIDA, that's National Institute of Drug Abuse in the US, fund research to find harms through which government agencies can then disseminate negative findings to Congress, the media, and public through official reports, press releases, and drug education pamphlets. So indeed, funding and cannabis supply for research are monopolised by NIDA, who focus on, their mission is on finding drug addiction and harmful consequences of drug use. And over 90% of drug studies are funded by NIDA, which means almost all the money that comes into research about cannabis basically is there to identify harmful consumption patterns. And we end up with a system, it's basically sophisticated reefer madness. And I think this quote sums it up. It's difficult to get someone to understand something when their salary depends on them not understanding it. And this happens, we definitely see it in Australia and absolutely in the US and other countries. And the result is there's always a machine there to enforce this research that is supposedly there to help us. But in the session following this, we'll talk about the human cost of this research and then the rules in more detail. Now, I know that no one here at Mardi Gras would be inclined to believe any conspiracy stories, but there is another layer of intrigue to all of this. According to the New York Times, industry insiders privately refer to rehab patients who produce profitable urine specimens as thoroughbreds. They're the lifeblood of a money hustle that began 50 years ago, one that was started almost single-handedly by Robert DuPont, a former US drug czar under Presidents Nixon and Ford, and the first ever NIDA director. Needless to say, DuPont owned testing labs for testing people and continues to benefit financially from invasive testing practices. And I know he was actually advising Jeff Sessions. I'm not sure if you know him in the US. He drives, he's head of the Justice Department over there. So when those sorts of people are influencing policy today, it's, I think it's a big problem. So from the deficit model, we move to the public health framework, which is another major framework in the academic literature. The public health approach is a more nuanced recognition that most cannabis-related harm is concentrated within a minority of high-risk consumers. It's the Pareto's law, where 80% of cannabis, we think, is consumed by about 20% of the most hardcore people who consume. So issues identified in the public health literature associated with cannabis consumption include increased risk of cognitive impairment, added risk of traffic crashes, dependency, and mental health problems. These are all very common. I heard Justin Sinclair talking the other day, debunking a lot of these. Causation has never been established, but it's still there and it's still common. We heard it just this last week coming from Greg Hunt about the gateway method, and no one challenged them on it, but they should. So from the public health perspective, the risk of these harms is amplified by heavy and frequent use, long user careers, and early initiation into use. especially if people start consuming cannabis earlier than 15. But I say, is context too much to ask for? Because one of the common ones you always hear is, for example, about psychosis. And even the biggest hawks in the academic literature say that because causality has not been established, but there's always this association, even it would take 5,000 people to be prevented from using cannabis to prevent one potential psychotic episode. So this is all, it's never in the literature. It's like the headline, cannabis causes psychosis, but when you realize it's potentially 1 out of 5,000 people, there's never any context there. So that's one of the issues with the public health framework. A public health approach consists of assessing and monitoring, surveillance, and it's not like we haven't already got enough of that around. Usually this is via survey instruments, and then the idea is that they expand access to treatment of other interventions where someone else decides it's needed. At the core, the public health approach assumes people who consume cannabis lack capacity to make health choices with themselves, which aligns with the paternalistic philosophy of drug policy, basically where the state needs to take care of you. And in my mind, that's nanny state. Excuse me, but your nanny state is standing on my liberty, and I want my liberty back, please. And finally, the other major framework in the academic literature is the harm reduction approach. In general, the harm reduction approach encompasses a pragmatic method of accepting the reality of substance use while directing effort at minimizing the harmful consequences. Expanded harm reduction definitions include harms caused by ineffective drug policies, for example, prohibition, things like jail time and wrecked lives and that sort of thing. The harm reduction approach in a commercial cannabis market might include regulating limits to THC potency, encouraging higher CBD ratios, or preventing predatory marketing strategies. So we can say clearly the public health and the harm reduction approaches are a step forward from the deficit model. While they also remain very much controversial, I have to admit, but that discussion is for another time. But what about non-harmful cannabis consumption? Sorry, just go back. Well, consuming cannabis is not without risk. Like everything in life, most cannabis use does not constitute a significant risk or threat to public health. That's at the individual or population levels. So if we look at statistics from the overall burden of disease, we can see there that cannabis contributes less than 0.25%, much less than other illicit drugs, alcohol and tobacco, up there at 8%. So, considering how many people consume cannabis, that's a very low number. Obviously, there's other stats we could throw in there, like no deaths and all that sort of thing. So statistics from the literature indicate that approximately 90% of people who consume cannabis will not reach the levels of clinical dependence. And this vast block of people with non-problematic use are very hard, if not impossible, to find in the academic literature, I would say. And then we come to what about beneficial consumption? So for beneficial consumption, there's 2 parts, which I'll come to in a minute. So the deficit public health and harm reduction frameworks lack capacity to examine beneficial consumption. Most people would exclude the benefits of drug use when devising strategies to reduce harm. That's from a couple of well-known cannabis policy academics, and it's unclear why they would say this. I haven't managed to figure that one out. So this view illustrates a noteworthy gap in the literature, and I'm talking now about specifically the cannabis academic literature. It discounts at least 2 potential benefits, namely the combined use of medical and recreational intent, for example, stress relief and pleasure. So Can recreational use be medical? I think absolutely it can, but I know I've come to realise this last week it's quite a controversial topic. Some people say, no, medical should be completely separate and two different things, but personally I think there's a fair bit of crossover there. So much consumption, according to the literature, is considered medical and recreational. Some consumers even refuse to distinguish between the two of them. Medical consumers tend to emphasise the relieving effect over the pleasurable outcomes. 85% of medical consumers also reported using cannabis recreationally. And there's the window between an effective medical dose and one that intoxicates is very narrow. And this is one of the problems with the moralists, because they think, well, if it intoxicates, you're not allowed it as medicine. And I have this quote here from Steve D'Angelo. I'm sure many of you have heard of him, a pioneer in California. His book, which I'll come back to later on, he says, defining cannabis consumption as elective recreation ignores fundamental human biology and history and devalues the very real benefits the plants provide. So basically my point of all this is just to point out that there is a big percentage, whatever it is, a big chunk of cannabis consumers who use it both medically and recreationally, and I'd call that definitely a benefit of cannabis consumption. And the next topic is pleasure. This is one of the issues that again is almost missing in the academic literature. So several scholars have found the overwhelming reason for consumption is pleasure, and this one always makes me laugh because it's like these guys are academics that get paid money to find out that, you know what, can actually be fun to smoke pot, and it always cracks me up. How much do you get paid for that insight, mate? But so perhaps unsurprising, this is an unsurprising finding, given that an often used description of the effect of cannabis on mood is euphoria. So the term pleasure has become marginalised in discourses that seek to understand drug use. And it's plausible that cannabis consumers are managing the interplay between the positive effects of a drug, pleasure maximisation, and the risks associated with administering or taking a drug, that's harm reduction. So everyone knows this sort of idea stems from Zinberg's controlled use. When you're in your community, your peers will educate on safer consumption patterns, this sort of thing. So as may be deduced, I managed to figure this out. Euphoria is not generally defined as a harm per se, and I think the literature needs to get on board with this. Thus, and we come to the end of the first part of the speech. So these categories of cannabis use that is not significantly harmful, juxtaposed recreational and medical intent and pleasure, constitute a majority of cannabis consumers. And this is where the limitations of the HR, the pH, and the deficit models become most salient. For millennia, cannabis use has been associated with wellness, particularly at the nexus of mind, body, and spirit. So despite this seemingly obvious match, the literature that incorporates cannabis policy into wellness conceptions is thin. So now I'll move into the second part of the talk, cannabis and wellness. So this first section that I'm going to talk about is basically it's a review of the academic literature of what wellness is. There's not too much about cannabis in it because, like I said, there's nothing in the literature about that. And then the second part is more about what people who consume cannabis have written about it, and there's some well-known ones. So this, like I said, this part's just a review of the academic literature of wellness. And I've followed the Dunn spectrum of wellness. Dunn was a person in 1959 who was one of the first modern people to come up with the idea. The concept of wellness has a history of over 5,000 years. More recently, it's evolved from a psychosomatic framework defined as involving or depending on both the mind and body as mutually dependent entities. It's evolved in response to changing demographics, existential angst of the modern world, a critique of disease-based models of health that prioritize funding for treatment as opposed to prevention, And the overall goal of wellness is to lead full, rewarding lives and maximize the potential. It's more than about being free of disease or being unsick. So this is also in alignment with WHO principles. Health is complete physical, mental and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. Wellness conceptions are holistic and encapsulate a range of strategies both for disease prevention and enabling of a positive lifestyle. The spectrum of wellness is flexible, both as an academic framework and also as a counselling technique. So notions of wellness seek to move from dichotomous conceptions of sickness and health towards a graduated spectrum. And wellness is a biopsychosocial phenomenon that integrates the internal and external environment, ranging from physical functioning, ability to deal with disease, to psychologic, emotional, cognitive, spiritual well-being, to safety, wealth, freedom, opportunity and happiness. Philosophically, Heidegger conceived wellness as encompassing 4 realms, including earth, sky, mortals and divinities, and he called it the so-called ringing of the fourfold. It's a pretty straightforward concept. You've got illness at one end, in the middle there's the comfort zone, which is false wellness, and then moving down towards optimal health at the other end. So although originally related to physical health, a multidisciplinary focus has come along and theoretical grounding was added in the Wheel of Wellness. The Wheel of Wellness includes 16 interrelated measurable dimensions such as creativity, spirituality, nutrition, exercise, pleasure, stress management. All of these things I think we can safely assume are quite closely connected with cannabis. Historical and first-hand accounts of cannabis use activity have been associated with its consumption with the enhancement of many of these Wheel of Wellness components that I just mentioned. Advocates of consuming cannabis as a tool for achieving wellness tend to frame its use around psychological, physical and spiritual conceptions. That's mind, body, spirit. The motivation or intent for consuming cannabis is seen as a central premise of the spectrum of wellness. So I come back again to Steve D'Angelo. I'm not sure if any of you have read this book, but it's a good one. In his book, Steve D'Angelo says, in most cases, cannabis consumption can be categorized as either wellness use or misuse, and the difference can only be discerned in the mind of the consumer. When cannabis is ingested with conscious intent to produce a desired effect that brings some value to life, then it's being used for wellness purposes. So the intent can range from anger management to enhancing a meal, laughter, stress relief. It's not the effect that's important so much, it's actually that the consumer be able to honestly identify the value that consuming cannabis brings to his or her life. Also another great book by Joan Bellow, if I can recommend it if you haven't come across this yet. So from this perspective, the key to consuming cannabis in a manner that enhances wellness is staying committed to a productive life and accepting responsibility for individual actions. A key feature of the spectrum of wellness is the prioritization of self-responsibility for the individual in making conscious health choices. This aspect is also a harm reduction principle and relates to the capacity of a cannabis consumer to self-identify when consumption is problematic and then take steps such as seeking treatment to address the issue if it's problematic. So in this way, cannabis consumption can be interpreted as a process of self-medication that allows consumers to take greater control in self-assessing their individual health requirements. And I think this is an important part of wellness, the perception of being well. So when it comes to evaluating wellness, there's a range of psychometric instruments available to evaluate individual wellness. Clinical measures tend to focus on depression, distress, anxiety, or substance abuse. The psychological tradition, subjective evaluation of life satisfaction, which is probably more closely aligned with the wellness spectrum. Wellness evaluation tests that have been independently assessed for validity and reliability include the 5-factor wellness inventory that measures almost 100 different items, and the perceived wellness survey, which includes physical, spiritual, and psychological dimensions. At the most fundamental level, there are 3 questions cannabis consumers can ask themselves about their consumption. This quote, again, is from Steve D'Angelo, whose book, The Cannabis Manifesto, I mentioned before. So first, the consumer could ask him or herself, what effect am I seeking? How will that effect bring value to my life? And will my cannabis consumption at this time negatively impact me or anybody else? So basically, if you can answer those questions positively, then there's a possibility that your cannabis use is going to improve your wellness potentially. So this particular picture, there's nothing really relevant about it to the talk, it's just I liked it, so I put it in. Not much more to say about that. So now I get to cannabis and the wellness industry. Wellness industry, not including cannabis, currently adds 3.7 trillion US to the global economy. That's 3 times the pharmaceutical industry, which is obviously massive. Many aspects in the Global Wellness Institute report are relevant to cannabis markets currently emerging around the world. Companies have emerged combining wellness activities such as hiking, infused massage, and art classes. For my research, I've been in Colorado a few times, and they're all over the place, these sorts of small businesses. The GWI report identified multiple categories in the wellness industry that have an association with cannabis, and that includes complementary and alternative medicines, mind, body and spirit, and fitness. And I'll just run through those at the moment. So there's a lot of complementary and alternative medicines, but the most common categories include use of wellness products such as botanicals, probiotics and nutraceuticals as dietary supplements, traditional techniques such as acupuncture and aromatherapy, and medicinal plants. Psychoactive substances are generally not classified as herbal or dietary supplements. However, several authors have pointed out that this potential exists for herbal cannabis and advocate for such a classification. Also, non-psychotropic compounds of cannabis such as CBD and hemp seed oils are widely used in this regard. Now we come and have a look at mind and body. I'm not sure if some of you have read this book. Also has lots of interesting information about this topic. There's a long association between the consumption of cannabis and wellness techniques associated with mind-body, particularly around yoga, meditation and spiritual exploration. For example, the use of plant medicines such as cannabis in yogic philosophy dates to the Yoga Sutras about 400 in the Common Era. Based on years of self-experimentation, Dassault considers all cannabis consumption when used in a mindful way as medicinal. That's both as treatment and preventative. When combined with yoga, this is again according to Dassault, regular moderate doses of cannabis rather than larger amounts less frequently are a tonic to support a powerful healing system for mental health and wellness, and we heard a lot about that yesterday. Very impressive talk. Dassault also advocates microdosing. This is one of the trendy terms around, but I think it is quite relevant for wellness purposes. If you can find your minimum effective dose, which probably a doctor can't tell you because the different strains, the different pharmacology, the tolerance, all that, and that's where it comes back to the subjective interpretation again. So, as I mentioned, Dassault advocates microdosing and more often rather than binging hard less frequently. And an extra part of the mind-body association is spirituality. Regarding spirituality, it was noted above that this is an important component of wellness. Spirituality can be defined in many different ways. One example is expanded consciousness beyond limitations of space and time. That's by Stanislav Grof. I'm not sure if you know that guy, a very well-known consciousness academic, explorer, psychedelic expanded consciousness academic. Another example of defining spirituality is a feeling of connectedness to the universe that transcends material aspects of life. So these definitions of spirituality are distinct from narrow concepts of religiosity, which refer to institutional beliefs. Continuing on with spirituality, there's descriptions of using cannabis to obtain spiritual states of consciousness. That is, the entheogenic consumption of cannabis have a history, again, that spans for millennia, and I've put some authors down here. Myself personally, I've probably got 10 different books of this at home. It's a fascinating topic. And in 2017, a church was established in Denver that allows members to consume the sacred flower to reveal the best version of self through ritual and spiritual practice. And I actually I interviewed these guys on one of my trips over to Colorado, and they're interesting guys, that's for sure. They call themselves elevationists, super smart, clear, but consciously consuming cannabis to aid their spiritual journeys. So the spectrum of wellness from academic perspective is a useful framework for exploring cannabis consumption from this perspective compared to the dominant ones I outlined previously. And so yeah, I think we're all pretty aware of what cannabis can do around in this crowd spiritually, so I won't dwell too much on that. And the last one that I'm going to talk about is fitness. So this is an emerging relationship between cannabis consumption and fitness. We all know the lazy stoner stigma, but it's not necessarily the case. There's multiple assumptions shared by the fitness movement and the wellness industry. These include taking personal responsibility for health, interconnectedness of mind, body and spirit, and a belief in the positive connotations of getting back to nature. So a recent example of putting all this together is a fitness and cannabis industry is opening a gym in the US, which is the self-reported world's first cannabis gym in California. I'm not sure if you've heard of this one. According to the websites, many members may consume cannabis at the gym before or after working out in a full-blown health and wellness center focused on full-body integrative health, wellness, and fitness. So obviously there's very little in the academic literature relating to the consumption of cannabis for fitness purposes beyond a systematic review of 15 studies I found that concluded that THC does not enhance exercise performance. I mean, I'm not sure how much these guys get paid to come up with this stuff, but there's anyway a growing number of anecdotal reports of the benefits of cannabis for fitness purposes, particularly around the notion of increased stamina. And here's just a few headlines, like any quick search for cannabis and wellness, and all the major newspapers are running stories on it these days. I might add the reason I added this section is for myself personally, gave up alcohol for 3 months, and might have had a bit of a herbal remedy and went for a 25k bike ride for every day for 3 months and lost about 10 kilos. So personally, I think there's something to this. So things like runner's high, the epic treks, all of this stuff. Personally, I believe cannabis can definitely be beneficial in this regard. So it was also reported that athletes regularly use cannabis for wellness and mental wellness. In this situation, mental wellness is, when we talk about like getting in the zone. So that's why you hear about lots of NBA, baseball, NFL players consume right before the match, because that helps them to obviously like be in the moment, get in the zone, and perform to their peak abilities. Anecdotal evidence and subjective experience, I believe, is a very valuable source of knowledge regarding the therapeutic effects of cannabis, but as I keep saying, basically there's nothing of that in the literature. If it's not a clinical, double-blind, peer-reviewed, randomized study, then they don't count it, and they're missing out on basically everything as far as cannabis is concerned. So the spectrum of wellness can again examine cannabis consumption from the perspective of overall improved health, instead of just limiting how harmful it is to the health. So there's a few advantages with it. Analytically speaking, as I said, it's about the theoretical framework. There's a long association, and this is reflected in emerging cannabis wellness industry in the US. There's the encouragement of taking responsibility for your own health choices. The spectrum is not only useful analytically, can also be employed for counselling as a multi-level healing process. And stress management is an example of where cannabis use can potentially benefit overall health. It offers, this is the main reason why I like the spectrum of wellness for an academic framework, is that it offers the possibility of examining much broader perspectives of cannabis consumption, basically the whole spectrum, and compared to like 10% of harmful consumption patterns. And the spectrum of wellness has the ability to contextualize both non-harmful cannabis use and high-risk activities. Also, the second point here is one that I think is quite important. I'm not sure how much to talk about this one. The idea of combining the recreational and medical markets. I know from my research in Colorado, lots of the regulators say that from a regulatory burden perspective, it's the most efficient way, and at one end of the spectrum you can still have the medical cannabis with clinical compounds, and at the other end you could have someone who grows their own plants at home to relieve stress. But I'd actually, like I said before, I didn't realise this was a controversial point. It just seems practical to me that it's the same plant. And I'll just tell you, like when I was over in Colorado, for example, I go to a big grow facility over there, and they have the exact same strain, the exact same plant, just in different corners of the warehouse. One of them has a yellow tag and one has a blue tag, and then they required like 3 different licensing types for each, and had to go to a different sort of dispensary, one medical, one recreational, and just added all this regulatory burden, and it just seemed ridiculous that there was 2 separate markets when there was in fact so much crossover between the two. So my personal view is I would like to see one unified market, but as I said, I know that's controversial. And also it's complementary to and can build on practical harm reduction guidelines that aim to reduce risks associated. And just come to the conclusion, so there's actually broad consensus in some areas among the deficit, public health and harm reduction and wellness models. This particularly around the notion that cannabis consumption is problematic for some consumers, or that it's probably best not to drive when you're baked. I mean, most sides all agree on this, even though the deficit side tend to frame it that everyone's going to be out there hammered on the roads. Furthermore, there's broad overlap between wellness and harm reduction frameworks, particularly around the notion of controlled use and self-responsibility for health choices. The key difference between the spectrum of wellness and the public health approach relates to surveillance. So in the spectrum of wellness, the individual is encouraged to self-monitor and check for harmful consumption patterns and seek help when needed. Whereas in the public health framework, health professionals oversee survey instruments and guide the most vulnerable to treatment interventions. Additionally, the spectrum of wellness differentiates from harm reduction conceptions in that it can consider non-harmful and beneficial cannabis consumption. The spectrum of wellness may be useful as a complementary academic framework with broader coverage of cannabis consumer activity than is currently apparent in the academic literature. So if proponents of the dominant deficit perspective that focus on harmful drug use were concerned that the harm reduction model was sending the wrong message by pragmatically accepting that people will use cannabis whether it's outlawed or not, they may be enraged by a theoretical model that can consider potentially beneficial consumption within the context of a wellness approach to health. And a classic example of this exact point, it's just in the last week, not cannabis related, but about the pill testing down in Canberra. We have some people jumping out of the woodwork saying this is outrageous, how could they do it? And yet we know 2 people's lives were saved from that. And so, you know what? If they're not prepared to accept evidence that's been provided by massive studies for over a century and continue to churn out this debunked nonsense, then, well, fuck them. And that's my talk.